My name's Ian Williams. I'm a PhD student at the CUNY Graduate Center. My degree is in social welfare, but my home is somewhere in the digital humanities and then public scholarship, sociology, all that fun stuff. I'm joined with my colleague Sion, who's a PhD candidate in sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center, and Ezra, who is, or have you finished your degree now, or are you a candidate?
Not yet.
Oh, cool. Still work candidate for a master's in sustainability at the City College of New York. So we're going to give a little background. I have some slides to help guide our discussion. So I'm going to transition to that. And then we're going to each give short presentations of about 10 minutes each. We do have some wiggle room in terms of time because the Zoom room is not needed after this. So if things run over a little bit for conversation, we can do that. But to be judicious with our time and everybody else's, we'll try to stick to the hour, and then I'm happy to stick around and chat after. So our presentation, Forging Links Between Public Scholarship, Civic Tech, and Open Data, a showcase of CUNY public scholarship practice-based projects, focuses mostly on the public scholarship practice space, but we're also part of the social practice CUNY, and we'll talk a bit about that. So in terms of presenters and contributors, there's the three of us, as well as our colleague Jacqueline, who's also in the PhD program in social welfare, who could not join us tonight. The CUNY Graduate Center, where a lot of this work is housed and incubated at, is often considered like the crown jewel of CUNY, and CUNY is the largest urban public education system or university system in the US. I think it's actually the largest public education system too for higher education. But one of our core beliefs is that knowledge is a public good. And the Graduate Center itself, it was founded in 1961 and then given its current name in 1969. It's housed in the beautiful former B. Altman department store. It's diagonally across the street from the Empire State Building. And there's a lot of public events and programs there, all sorts of stuff. So I definitely encourage you, if you're not familiar with the Grad Center, check it out. But public scholarship is really in our bones and in what we do. The public scholarship practice space, which funded some of our work and supports our projects, and that was established out of the Center for the Humanities at the Graduate Center, came into being in 2023 as incubated out of what used to be the Publics Lab. And it really serves to honor the past, present, and future of public scholarship at the Graduate Center. It funds and organizes a range of activities, including some generous summer research fellowships, which I was able to make use of, Sion was able to make use of, and it helps us to create knowledge and work for the public good. And that's something really important to do. Social Practice CUNY, another project, is a pedagogical experiment educational platform supporting the integration and support of studio art with interdisciplinary research, community collaboration, environmental justice, and critical urbanism. And it links practitioners working at the intersections of art and social justice from all the CUNY campuses. So a lot of these are CUNY-wide initiatives and projects. That's what brings Ezra into our fold tonight too. And so the starting kind of provocation and question for organizing this is that public scholarship and open data have a lot in common. They kind of co-emerged at a similar time, but they're often not talked about at the same time. Like they're not in parallel. So I wanted to ask, how does open data look and how does Open Data Week look from the lens of public scholarship, where we're aiming often to produce accessible, open access materials for public audiences, often related to contemporary social issues that are really rooted in the communities where we live and we practice, and often participatory research methods in service of justice, equity, and social change. I feel like there's a lot of connection there. There can be some tension sometimes too, but it's a productive thing to put together. So these are a couple of books that are quite good about public scholarship. Unfortunately, neither of them are open access. Academia has a long way to go to realizing some of its ideals. So I'm going to talk first a little bit, taking you through a journey through open data, civic tech, and critical data literacies. As a background, a few years ago, I was taking a class in interactive data visualization and another course on the history and philosophy of statistics. And we had to work with census data, and it was a class that the data viz class required more background than I had. Like I should have taken a JavaScript course beforehand or a data viz class. I had the opportunity to take it. I signed up and it was pretty hard. And we were working with census data. And my wife mentioned that the NYC School of Data back in 2023, there was someone in the lineup who was from the Census Bureau who was doing public education, and she was volunteering there. Why don't I come and see how data is out in the world? And I think I'd heard about School of Data before. Like some of my friends who are more in civic tech and hacker spaces or were programmers talked about it, but it didn't quite register on my radar, which is more our background in social work and the humanities. But I went. It was a really amazing conference. I'm like, I want to bring some of the cool things that are happening at CUNY into this, particularly in the digital humanities and public interest tech. So the next year I organized a panel that some of my colleagues were generous enough to join me on this adventure. And then the next year I got drawn into some panels and presentations about housing data and one about envisioning the CUNY public interest tech pop-up, which is happening right now with a whole bunch of events. And I definitely recommend you check it out. It's in the Oculus World Trade Center. But it was this journey into this world. And along the way, I kept thinking about the language and the sort of use of open data. And I've been researching technology adoption in human services and around social problems for many years. I was always like the tech person in a lot of nonprofits and government jobs, even though I wasn't the tech person, but I could work with databases and work with IT. So I started going to the Discover Open Data workshops, which are awesome. And they're every week. You could take one tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's online, or Thursday or Friday. They're really good. Definitely recommend doing one of these if you can. They're also monthly, but right now they're available. But it made me think about these questions of like, how do people learn and find meaning in data? Who are the publics and also the counter publics? I was talking with a friend earlier about his research of the undercommons on social media spaces as kind of alternative ways people find and create communities online. But I also thought about, okay, in terms of the sorting of data, even just through who's responsive and who's showing up or who's making use of this, whose interests get prioritized. And the big question that I think is still open is open data as democratizing as it promises. And I don't have an answer to that, but I just want to open that question up as a provocation. So through these journeys, I got more involved with the civic tech communities. I'd been doing some work with the CUNY Public Interest Tech Lab, and they had a partnership with Beta NYC. And I came to see and think of open data from a government perspective, and digital governance, right, often comes from, there's a bit of legislation, there's a bit of litigation, there's some transformation, and there's prefiguration. There's a lot of experimenting, but there's also a lot of change, and civil society and civic tech groups play a huge role in that, as well as the cultures and communities there. So a lot of open data came out of civic hacking groups through crowdsourcing, web scraping, information sharing, creating archives and counter data sets, but also people were often rooted in activism, social movements, and there was a lot of public scholarship that overlapped there that maybe doesn't show up as much in like official statistics or open data portals, but it's all kind of overlapping. And this is just a photo from the reopening of the PIT pop-up in January, where Noel Hidalgo, the executive director of Beta NYC, was talking about this history and like the old hacker spaces and how happy he was to see this space. So I'm zooming out of it and trying to understand the civic tech world. I happened upon the Civic Tech Field Guide, which is a really great website. It was started by Matt Stempeck, who now lives in Portugal, used to work for Microsoft Research, and then did a lot of civic tech stuff. But he basically helped start this crowdsourced list of just aggregating all these projects from around the world. And I thought of this question as I was looking at this and thinking about this. If a civic tech tool is released and nobody uses it, does it have any impact, or people don't know about it? So people are creating all these things. I guess it's the same thing as a data set, right? If it's there, but it's not being used, then what good does it serve, or how can it be used better? But again, situating a lot of this, the emergence of open data and open data practices, often at local levels, are also part of these global movements that within those spaces, there's overlapping concepts and terms. For instance, like even civic tech and public interest tech or tech for good. There's a lot of assumption, but also creation and support of digital literacies and domain knowledge. Like people are learning skills. Hackathons at these kind of events are often good places to do that, to learn and practice with projects. But also the effectiveness and the impact of these can have multiple meanings. So in my journeys and as part of my summer project last year, I came upon the Impacts of Civic Technologies conference, which I'd heard of, and it popped up in a few spaces and a few Slack channels that I was in. But they're like the big global civic tech conference. They were organized by this UK-based nonprofit, or there it's the charity, but My Society, that does a lot of government modernization and digitalization. It started in 2015 in, I think, a time that was a bit more optimistic and in some ways like hopeful about the nature of digitalization, data, like the internet, that Web 2.0 could be this democratizing force. And so it was a global hub for all of that. And looking at this, I'm wondering, I'm like, what is the democratic project of civic tech? What are some of its imaginations and horizons, and who are some of the key players? And these were just some pictures I took from the conference I went to, including a cool little, they had 3 sessions for unconferences organized within. And so I went to this conference in Mechelen, Belgium last summer, in there somewhere in both those photos. But I just went to observe, to take it in, to talk to people. Mostly it was practitioners, a lot of like human rights activists around the world, some academics and researchers, journalists, really interesting mix of folks, really eye-opening conversations that I think helped me think, okay, how do I rethink learning about open data and data literacy? So TICTeC released this report. I'm going to skip through it quickly, but essentially they're reframing their idea about democracy and tech and not assuming that the relationship is one-to-one or automatic. But last year, I think we went through a lot of rethinking, particularly in the US, but also elsewhere, where like large tech firms maybe turned away from this embrace of being democratizing and pro-democracy. So the other aspect of my project is I then tried to fold a bunch of these ideas into creating a different workshop to introduce social work students to 311 and open data, but ask these questions about data justice and open data literacy. So I piloted this for a friend's class last summer and wrote about that in the trip. But more recently, I'm now a part of this thing called the CUNY AI Lab. That's kind of a nascent R&D space within the Graduate Center. And one of the tools that was created there was a like vibe coding site studio that uses Cloud Code. So I had an idea about creating a pedagogical website, but it's actually quite labor intensive. And then I'm like, all right, I'm just going to tinker around and see what happens. And it's a work in progress, but it was something fun and interesting to play around with. And hopefully something that I've spent a lot of time developing educational resources around digital literacy. And often it is rooted in these critical perspectives that I think go back to some of the ethos of civic tech and the hacker communities, and thinking about like social justice and the public interest in tech. And so now where I'm thinking about that is that even in the last year, the conversation has changed a lot. And there were little what are called signals in the futurism world last year of bits and pieces. AI as a conversation piece, as a technology, like has been kind of on everybody's mind for quite a while now, especially since the public release of ChatGPT. But we are seeing some really interesting shifts this year in terms of both like policy and technology. So for instance, like the Civic Tech Field Guide did this really interesting thing about community-led AI audits last year, and My Society was talking about it at TICTeC, but also like Data and Society, which is a really great technology research institute. They're doing a lot of stuff around AI, including this great talk that I went to about the kind of emergence of AI literacy in the job market in Atlanta. And there is a session at the School of Data that's going to be about this website, Civic AI Tools, that's also worth really checking out. But I wrote a blog post a little bit more about some of the AI literacy stuff, and I'm just under 10 minutes. So I'm going to hand it over. I have some readings to Ezra.
Thank you. I've started timing myself. So my name is Ezra. I'm going to talk about Okai Initiative. We started it 3 years ago after we received funding from Surdna Foundation, Hester Street, Living and Belong Institute at UC Berkeley through Little Manila Queens Bayanihan Arts, which is an art community-based arts collective in Manila, Queens. So the Jacqueline Reyes is our lead artist of Little Manila Queens Bayanihan Arts, and myself started Ukay Initiative to bring visibility to the transnational systems of secondhand clothing and informal economies that develop within that system and the peripheries of it. We aim to raise awareness on consumption, discard that feed into waste colonialism. And I think you probably have heard of that concept. It means that it's when a more influential developed country ships their waste to poorer, less influential country, polluting that country. Next, please. So UKAI is an acronym for Unearthing Knowledge arts and interdependence. And it's also a play of the word ukay, which is a Filipino term for referring to the secondhand market in the Philippines. When you go to Philippines, ukay is common throughout the country. Filipinos go to ukay, particularly those coming from low-income families, to find imported used clothing, shoes, bags, and other accessories that are sold at very low prices. As I said, they're very common throughout the country. There's even a second-hand capital in the northern region of the country that keeps on importing huge volumes of used stuff from the developed world. But that is not the primarily focus of this presentation. It's Open Data Week. I'll present data and tech since this is Open Data Week. Next, please. But to give you a bit more background about the project, I mentioned at the beginning that it is a transnational collaboration of artists, researchers, and cultural workers in New York City and in the Philippines. And through that collaboration, we're able to stage multiple projects. We're able to work with amazing folks in New York City and in the Philippines. And these are some of the projects. We staged a public activation in Metro Manila, Philippines. We staged a public activation in Little Manila, Queens, in New York City. We went to the Philippines to do our field research as well as even thrift stores here in New York City. We staged embroidery and repair workshops, partnering with institutions here. We commissioned 3 films. We staged a fashion photo shoot where models wear used clothes embroidered through traditional embroidery. We commissioned an indigenous group of artists in the Philippines. We made an ukay zine. We hosted a climate comedy show. But the focus of the presentations are 2 projects: fabric banner mapping, or transnational clothing pathways, as you may have read in the description of this event, and secondhand clothes characterization. A bit more context about why we did secondhand. Sorry, if you can move to the next slide, please. So why we did the secondhand clothes characterization, this was part of our effort to advocate for this policy concept called extended producer responsibility. You would probably have heard of this. It's a policy concept that extends the responsibility of the end of life of a product, that is to get producers and brands financially and operationally accountable to manage the end of life of when their products becomes waste. So we did that. We experimented with identifying the brands. So we characterized used clothes that we collected at the clothing swap in Little Manila, Queens, in New York City. And then in addition to identifying the brand name, we also identified the material content or the fiber type, if it's polyester, cotton, XYZ, or we also identified the manufacturing origin or where the piece of clothing was made from, whether it's made in China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, etc. The technology we used initially, I would say, rudimentary. One of which is rudimentary is we just had point and shoot digital cameras, and then we took photos of the clothing tag and then uploaded them to Azure. You probably know of Azure. It's Microsoft cloud and computing platform, but we leveraged their AI services to extract data from the clothing tags. We used computer vision or OCR or optical character recognition, AI search, and an open AI model that was GPT-4 at the time. So I am going to steal the screen and show what I have. Okay, so as I mentioned, we captured 800 photos out of around 600 pieces of clothing at the clothing swap. And then, again, in the spirit of open data, we created this new data set through participatory research with volunteers helping us photograph these garments and capturing these images. And then we visualized that through Tableau Public. So our analysis shows 4 prevalent brands in the clothing sample: Uniqlo, Gap, Old Navy, and H&M. It's common knowledge that these brands comprise a large share of the global fast fashion market. And then analysis shows that clothing are made out of different fiber types: acetate, acrylic, cotton, elastane. And we categorize them into whether they're synthetic or natural or semi-synthetic. And it's not surprising that our clothes are not just made up of one material, but many. And so that's why when you check your clothing tags, they'd be like 80% cotton or 80% polyester, and then the other would be something else. And then the brands is that, again, unsurprisingly, the clothes were made in China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Cambodia. And we all know that these countries historically share something in common, that is weak labor and environmental regulations, and that are leveraged by multinational companies. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch tabs, and because the description says clothing pathways. So Jacqueline designed these fabric banners to illustrate the many actors of the journey of secondhand clothes, from its origin to its disposal, from the developed world to the developing world. And I think I have very limited in time. So we know that we are consumers. The clothes all end up in landfills if they're not managed properly. And then there are sorters and collectors. They can be found in really industry level sorting. And then they are baled, shipped in big shipping containers, crossing oceans. And they are bought by traders and importers in the destination country. And then they end up in ukay-ukay, or the secondhand market in the Philippines, for example. This is not unique to the Philippines. Other developing nations has this too, but they're called differently in Mexico and in Ghana and many others. Okay, so this is one of the ukay-ukay sites we visited, and we used 360-degree footage. And you can find this available on our website. And then so you'd see how overwhelming that those used clothes are dumped into this one site in the country, and there are so many of them across the country. So the public scholarship component of this project is a public art exhibit. And we thought that art exhibit can function to translate research and theory and lived experiences into forms that people can actually engage with visually, emotionally, and collectively. And so that's what we did. We exhibited our work in the Philippines last year. And if you move to the next slide, we called it Worn Worlds, Acts of Repair and Threads of Peace in the Wake of Discard. And you would find, we memorialized this exhibit when you go to our website, ukay.nyc. And that's it. My 10 minutes is over. Thank you.
All right. I'm happy to be following in the footsteps of Ian and Ezra. So with that, I'm happy to start my portion and to talk about NYC Mesh, which is a case for public infrastructure and open data. So just to give an overview of what I'll be presenting over these next 10 minutes, this is all from my dissertation. I am a graduate student at the CUNY Graduate Center in the Sociology program. I am a scholar of organizations. It's more so nonprofits and grassroots that I'm interested in. And with that, nodes of innovation, it's a play on Innovation Hub, thinking of these large cities as these technological spaces in which a lot of the focus is on larger tech companies that are more driven for capital. And with that, I'm always interested in what is the community response, what's the local response to social phenomena, and how are everyday people coming together in order to express their own agency. So that's the play. Within New York City, yes, we have the Amazons or the Googles, but there are also smaller organizations that are leveraging technology with the public interest in mind. And within network studies, a collection of nodes, which is just smaller connection points that makes up the larger hub. So my work is really let's peer within the hub and look at the individual nodes, if you will. And to talk a little bit more about the theory that I'm engaging with and my overall research question, organizations such as NYC Mesh that is working on the digital divide, there are two spheres they're straddling. And the theory is one of strategic action fields, or quite simply, if we think of a field as an area in which there are materials and resources, who are the actors within these fields? What are the logics determining the actions? What's the framings or the goal in regard to all of the materials and resources? What are people trying to achieve within that field? So think of an industry at large. We have the technology field, but then there also is the field within civil society, and that's the field of community organizing. So NYC Mesh is straddling along both, and I'm just interested to know, how is the organization working on digital divide? How do they navigate between both of those spheres? With that, we can continue on in the next slide. Why is this important? Organizations working for digital equity. I don't think I have to tell anyone on this call why it's important, but with that, a lot of people outside of this call in 2026 may not realize the digital divide is something that is still present today. The digital divide, really quickly, just measuring sort of those with access to technology, mostly the internet and then computer hardware, and those that don't have access to those things. A lot of research peaked in the 90s, early 2000s, and then it continued on, but has tapered off because apparently everyone is now connected to the internet. But of course, there is a falsehood with that. While largely overall people have more access to the internet than the late 90s or early 2000s, there are people that still do not have access. And in thinking of the year of 2026, especially in the age of AI, we understand that access to the internet is important. And when thinking of where this problem still exists, it's everywhere, even in New York City. A recent report just this past summer, July of 2025, came out. I just put that link in the chat there, but 22% of people in the Bronx, just in that borough alone, don't have access to broadband at home. So something that we're seeing is that people are connected to the internet through a phone, but they don't have that broadband internet service. And why is that important? One real life example that we can point to is COVID. We saw that the internet in today's society, not just because of a national emergency, but even outside of that, people are logging on to go to school. People are logging on for work. So that digital divide is more important than ever to close. So NYC Mesh, it's one case study of my dissertation. They are a nonprofit founded in 2012, and essentially they use a network of satellites. So they'll go up to your roof, and then that is how they will essentially redirect the signal from one satellite to another in order to provide donation-based internet. And just to speak quickly on donation-based, as a nonprofit, its mission is about providing access to all New Yorkers. So there are suggested amounts to pay, not only for the install fee, but for monthly. But there's a wide range of people that NYC Mesh is working with. It's working with people that live at or below the poverty level. So with that, those people might be paying as much as they can. But then also, interestingly enough, they are working with very high income people. And those are people that might supplement the payment from those that can't pay. So NYC Mesh, it works across a broad spectrum of people, which I think is a bit interesting for this case study. And then it consists of a board and volunteers. So this is mostly volunteer run. As we go through more, all of this work, there's a core group of volunteers that will keep consistency, but a lot of the work of NYC Mesh, it's purely based on volunteers and not a paid staff. So just to give a snapshot, I'll dive more into this. But just to give you an idea of where they work, they're all over New York City, mostly the four boroughs, not including Staten Island. But their big hubs are lower Manhattan, which you'll see on this big picture. And then they go over to Brooklyn, mostly in the north and the west. If you look on the smaller picture on the upper right, that goes more into Brooklyn. So you'll see like Bushwick, Williamsburg, they're really big there, going down to Park Slope, Crown Heights, Sunset Park, they're big there. And then that bottom picture to the right, they are expanding in northern Manhattan. So they have a hub in Harlem, and then they have two nodes over in the Bronx, as you can see there. But once again, they're attempting to expand their footprint in the upper region of Manhattan. So with that, because volunteers are setting up internet to people, there also is an element of community education. While you can get a volunteer to set up your own internet, you too can set up your own internet. It essentially is just getting your own router. And then if you look on this picture here, if you look on top of the roof, you have the omnidirectional router. All of that's provided by NYC Mesh. So once again, installation fees covers that. If you do leave your building at any point, that's something you can keep, carry with you, or that's something that you just leave there. So we'll talk more about this, or for what you can think about in our discussion, this idea of like community-owned infrastructure. But this element of knowing at least the basics of internet operations, demystifying how the internet works, that's something that's very much a part of the ethos of NYC Mesh. It has its own wiki in order to guide people how to set up and work their own internet, especially if there are any issues in which folks might need to troubleshoot their own internet service. But I will say that happens just as much as it would if you were with Verizon or Spectrum. And then going along with this idea of open data, there's also dashboards as well. So going along with the wiki, if you go to the NYC Mesh website, all the information on nodes, usage, that's up there as well. And the idea of open data here here. It's up to people how they want to use this data, depending on the questions they have, depending on the project. But it's not to say just having this data is important, but it's accessible for people to use. So just to give a quick walkthrough, if you go to nycmesh.net, the first place I'll go to is their map. And those are the first pictures that I saw. So if you zoom in, we'll just do Lower Manhattan here, but that's one of their supernodes. So supernode 1934. If you hover over that, you can see all its other connections there. There you go. So these are all the other nodes that are essentially connected to this. And the blue are the supernodes, and then the red are the individual satellites on buildings. And then if you clicked on that, you'll see the panoramic view. For each new building, you need to take a 360 snapshot on the roof so, you can be lined up with another satellite. So that's also what's interesting, like network studies. In order for NYC Mesh to grow, it's going to need more satellites. But if it's not in a certain region, that's just because a satellite hasn't been put there. So Queens is one area it's attempting to grow in, obviously, as you can see from the map. But if we go back to the home page, and if you go down to stats, these are now the dashboard. So if you just keep scrolling down, all of those hubs we saw, you can monitor performance network. So this is how many megabytes or gigabytes are going into the node versus going out of it. So, there's data for that. Yeah, so public infrastructure and open data, the work of NYC Mesh, which is essentially a case for community-owned and operated internet, what comes down to having public infrastructure, and that goes hand in hand with open data. So when just thinking about what that means, infrastructure and data, they have to be inseparable. That infrastructure, the data that it collects, it needs to be open. There's no point in having infrastructure that's public if that data is then privatized and vice versa. Education and access would also need to be considered, and to take that to a more specific layer, access overall, but access, of course, along class and racial lines when thinking of a city like New York City. And then there are also still issues of governance and maintenance. If we have this infrastructure that people can access, rules and regulations around that, how are we involving community members to participate and give their voice, and then who is maintaining this public infrastructure. And with that, I'll pass it back to Ian to facilitate our discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Sion. Really love hearing about everybody's projects and seeing it all come together. I'll just say for my own kind of observation, it's really interesting, like the role of community action and like volunteer action, right? Like in all of these topics in all of our presentations, like there is this role of like people volunteering to care for infrastructures, to build data sets, to try to achieve social change and action. And I just think that's really interesting, like coming at it from very different projects. Just something I wanted to put out there, because I think so much of the civic engagement component of open data outreach is also about voluntary action. Cool. If anybody has any questions, or Sienna, is there anything you guys want to say first?
Yeah, I just wondered if you found Open Data Portal easy to use, or if you met a lot of challenges grabbing the data either manually or through API.
Yeah. I'll say for myself, I haven't played around with the API side yet. I intend to now. I think as I was covering a lot, I do feel like I'm someone who is very cautious and a bit skeptical, I think, about especially industry-driven and investor-driven narratives about technological change. Sienna did such a good job of framing that the digital divide is still here, right? So much of access, but also skills and social outcomes. And like the New York City Digital Equity Roadmap is a really great document for folks to read and familiarize themselves with. So I found like learning to interact with the portal can be challenging because it's a lot of information. I brought it up in a lecture in a friend's class last week about data and social policy. And it was a lot because it's okay, how do we filter down? Because the information is not designed for human eyes, right? Like machine readable open data is designed for software to read. And so it's interesting that now there are tools that like people can outsource some of that work. And some of those tools are designed to be transparent about the process. Some of those tools are designed to say, oh, it's magic. You don't need to think. You don't need to have skill or knowledge. And so people are producing all these websites and dashboards now, sometimes where I would say based on like questionable assumptions in terms of when they're like making spurious correlations about data. In some ways, like a counter to a more careful, community rooted approach to working with data about social issues is this kind of extractive bird's eye view, which we saw in some of the federal policy making, which I admit, like programs that I've worked on lost funding because of Doge, like family members and friends of mine have had their jobs or their careers undone. And a lot of like social programs that I believe very strongly in were harmed by this like data driven view of just access the data, automate the process, and remove the human expertise and understanding. So I know it's a long answer away from your question, but I do think that in some ways it's becoming easier and in some ways it's becoming more complicated.
Thank you.
And I'm just looking in the chat. We've got a question from Katie in regards to hopes for the Mamdani administration. And it's something that I think about. I hope. I will say, and love to hear from anyone else if there's any thoughts. There's obviously great work coming out of OTI, but yeah, I think there's still more work to be done specifically around turning attention to having new breath in the Internet Master Plan. I don't know how much Mamdani has been vocal on that, but I think one of the things I'm thinking through, while obviously that's going to be a lot for the Mamdani administration, I also think another way to think through any changes we see in this administration, what other political actors or community actors will come into the fold. Once again, going back to this idea of a strategic action field, from where are we seeing growth even outside of the mayoral administration? I think there's going to be hope for the administration, but that's only as much as he can plug into influential partners in the field.
Yeah. I do think an affordability agenda has a lot of room for making some good social progress in terms of access and digital equity, as well as often, I think, issues that might get ignored otherwise. I see Gina has her hand raised, so please speak.
It takes me a while to formulate the question because, like the data, there's so much to filter through and define. I'm really struck more and more these days, and particularly with these three presentations, by the repositioning and the relocating of the community and the human in these particular projects. And it's so evident that there's something going on that is empowering and creating connections between humans that's in some ways enacting what you're doing with the data, but in other ways, it's forcing the data and forcing your algorithms, forcing what you're doing to be something other than it's initially advertised. So there are justice questions here, and there are ontological, epistemic questions here. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on those, but I'm just really struck between these projects about that human element, which is very inspiring right now.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a great question. Sienna or Ezra, do you want to weigh in first? I have some thoughts, but I
can say something small. I mentioned in my presentation about participatory action research methodology that we used, and it is the human element of us collecting data, and not just collecting data, but we try to empower specifically our volunteers, our partner researchers, to not just to really just be there and do the work, but also to think with us and analyze what they're seeing, what they're feeling as they capture every single photo of a piece of clothing, how they look like. And what I'm trying to say is that the numbers, the data that we see, they're not just statistics. There's, as you said, Gina, like there's a human element to it. And how do they impact the everyday lives of folks, or specifically how the data that represents this used clothing, when they end up somewhere else, and how do they impact the lives of those who receive them?
One of the things to your question, Gina, that really struck me, and this is where I get excited about open data, but this idea of subversion, right? How do you use something for something else? And that's why I'm also interested in studying like the community organizations. It's the community response, because that idea of what you planned. Yeah, something comes to be that you didn't plan for in the first place. That's the innovation. Going back to, it's not just the big tech companies that are doing the innovation. It's the smaller nodes as well, if you will. Yeah, that's what gets me inspired too. But I think we focus on the humans and how people are interpersonally being affected by the use of technology. That's the focus for me, at least.
Yeah, I tend to think that there's like a few different lines of thought. One is I guess more like the activist, social worker, like public scholar. And then there's the like theory nerd, where I'm like, one way we could look at it is taking like a post-digital studies perspective, where so much of this narrative about the digital, about data, about technology, and even the narrative now about AI is this like othering abstraction away from us as if it's something separate from the world in which we live, which is filled with humans and non-humans. And we all live together and we have to make relations with each other and find ways to work. This stuff is so woven into our lives. Like even the idea of being like data driven is almost a meaningless term right now. It's not really any different. Like databases and like database technologies are so woven into the very concept of reality that's used in news, that's used in how we're educated, in policymaking. Like it's all there. So I think within that, there's a lot of room to be creative and be experimental and be brave and not be afraid to break the thing or do it the wrong way. And I think the other piece is like the entire purpose of like public facing open data sets is to encourage reuse, right? And that reuse can be very creative. It can be innovative. I really enjoy going to the data through design exhibits, for instance, right? Like those are really interesting ways that people are working with data. And a lot of the folks who are there, like, they might work as a data scientist or a computer programmer in their day job. And this is a way to express something different that's material, that's multimodal, that's embodied. So there's the aspect too. And then I think the last piece is thinking about like data points about like how they're collected or organized and the stories that they're used to tell. So in the workshop that I designed, the class is about homelessness and social policy. And in many ways, like the question there of looking at 311 data is like, what is missing from the story of people that are populating a map or a chart or a spreadsheet that just describe problems, and problems that are usually framed in terms of like public disorder or undesirable behavior. And it might be like someone is camping out on a park or on a street block. Someone is panhandling. Someone is intoxicated. Things that it just says it as a problem because someone complained. And a lot of the students, they're working in institutions that are either, they might be making those complaints and have policies about it, or they might be working in the agencies that respond to it. And if someone just takes a like data-driven narrative of just looking at the stats, of looking at the numbers, of looking at like the concentration of complaints, it does strip the humanity and the dignity of the people. And so like working with students to contextualize and contest that and carry on the legacy of organizations like Picture the Homeless that no longer exists, but did so much work about challenging these one-dimensional narratives, and also did a lot of policy work that includes the foundation that leads to now the Mamdani administration's trying to make universal public bathroom access a policy priority. Like that came out of the work of organizations like that. The room is ours. Thank you, Gina. Yes, and please check out the pit pop-up. It is awesome. So much fun and so much cool stuff happening in a little spot that you might otherwise just pass by.
And like most major trains go there. Too many excuses not to check it out.
Maybe a question for both Sion and Ezra. Where do you see your work presented here going next?
Here I can go. I think I have the most direct answer only because this is all towards my dissertation. And yeah, just to also give some more context to this. So my research is grounded very much me participating in the work that I'm researching. I started volunteering with NYC Mesh in the summer of 2024. before. So about a year, and then research officially began at the beginning of this year. So I'll continue interviews, observations, this and ethnography, what I'm doing, and across the summer. And then by May of 2027, this will, be hopefully a published dissertation. And I think I want to make this a case of how organizations, even if they were not fitting within the model NYC mesh, but how can organizations at all levels continue within digital equity? Because it's not just people on roofs putting up satellites. It's also people within policy, to your point, Ian, a lot around the education aspect of it as well. Yeah, the NYC mesh is one type, but when we think about, once again, technologies, organization, it's not just the 500 plus employees trying to go for an IPO. There are other organizations that can work with technology for the sake of public interest.
Amazing.
So the next step of this project is we're co-hosting a mask making workshop. Again, we want to make sure for our folks to have fun, participate, create something beautiful. So I'm going to put a link into the chat. So we're partnering with City College of New York, and it's supported by the New York City's Climate Justice Hub, and it's going to be on Tuesday, the day before Earth Day. So please sign up. We're going to make masks made out of recyclables, plastics, metal, and paper. And there'll be food.
That's awesome. Yeah, and the Climate Justice Hub is also a CUNY initiative, right? Like, I think that came out of the Center for Looking Ideas. That's one of the awesome things about being here is there's so many interesting publicly facing and publicly engaging projects. And that's what I love about both being a student and teaching here, right? Is like people even learning technical skills. And I even found this with like when I was taking data visualization classes. Yeah, sometimes people have an idea that maybe the best way they see forward is, okay, they want to spin it into some kind of startup and get some funding. But a lot of people want to do good. They want to make the world a better place. They want to make New York a better place. So I guess my answer for that same question is like I'm plugging away at my PhD. I'm working on an exam for candidacy. That's been the bane of my existence for a little while, but I'm getting through. Plan is finish the semester. I'm going to do a few more open data things. I'll be at the School of Data and the Unschool of Data. This is a really fun and interesting week, but then I'm going to be a little quieter until I get this thing done. And a lot of these questions have been burning in the back of my head, and the challenge is sometimes turning a whole bunch of questions and linked ideas into a focused problem. I see also Katie made a plug for the Public Science Project, which I do want to throw a shout out to. That's another great initiative that came out of CUNY. That's cool. So they do a summer institute in critical participatory action research that I had heard about well before I considered applying to the grad center. It's got a good reputation and a long history.
I'm seeing a question in the chat as well around like employment and the community response to that. I'll take that just being that but no, please others, I'll start us off, but others chime in. That's a complicated question for me only because I'm sure there are organizations within New York City that's focused on like tech and employment. Even just one example that comes up, Girls Who Code, if you will. But there's a lot of organizations that's what are the skills needed to make sure people are employable. But with that too, and this is where now the complication comes, while it's yes, it's important to prepare a broad, diverse group of people to enter the technology field, but then there's also, I think, organizations that stray on the sort of tech solutionism side, where if we just give these people these skills, everything will work. For instance, 10 years ago, we thought everyone just needed to learn how to code in order for them to all reach the middle class, and that sort of was an empty promise. Yeah, that's important, definitely, but then I also think there are just around just making sure that more people are into tech. I think there's also just larger labor issues as well. So maybe when we think about making sure community college kids specifically are ready for the tech labor field, maybe reading into literature just around labor studies might be helpful. I don't know. Ian, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got plenty of thoughts on that. Yeah, like the learn to code. Another part of the digital divide, Daniel Green wrote this fantastic book called The Promise of Access. That was a kind of critical study of the concept of the digital divide and the idea that like at the same time as a lot of like social programs were being dismantled or restructured in the US in the 90s, at the same time like telecommunications were being deregulated and the internet was always imagined in the US as a privately owned entity, because a lot of the telecoms regulations going back to the New Deal were starting to be opened up at the same time as border and free trade agreements were changing. So a lot of restructuring of the state. And we're living out a lot of that consequence because in many ways, the inroads to the middle class, a lot of like safety net social programs have just been like hollowed out, and especially around economic crises. So we are seeing like, I was reading the city comptroller, Mark Levine, wrote a really interesting report about the labor market. I think it just came out last week or the week before, but there's a lot of interesting details about how young adults now who are entering the workforce are experiencing like a really difficult labor market. So I think there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of narrative about like the specter of AI automation and technological unemployment. The concept of technological innovation was formed in many ways in the shadow of mass unemployment. Benoit Godin, who was a history and philosophy of science professor at the University of Montreal, he wrote a lot of really good like critical innovation studies work. So there's this like long view of we're living out these messages. And I think what Weldon's raising about what's being encountered with students, like this is very real, right? Like the fear. And I graduated in 2008 with a liberal arts degree, and I could not find a steady job for a long time. I worked a lot of low wage jobs, a lot of manual labor and food service, and like it was very rewarding, meaningful work. And it led me through activism and community organizing to social work. But I think there is this real angst right now where I think people have a fear of being left behind. And also, in some ways, there's an irresponsibility of hyper individualizing all of this and pushing all of this on like technology skills as the ticket out and the ticket between like widening inequality. There was a really good study, I'll put it in the link, that Data and Society Research Institute commissioned. I had a picture of it in the last slide, but it was this really good ethnographic look at the kind of AI literacy and job market in Atlanta. And it was really interesting, really situated. But I think that's just something to me, like I think about the historical thing and maybe again, like the role of public scholarship to dismantle and like shake the tree on these taken for granted, quote unquote, truths or like realities that are a set of choices and the consequence of policy choices and the consequence of the distribution of resources. So going back to the Mamdani administration, like pushing for more redistributive policies and like funding social programs and being honest about the under budgeting of many things and the way that we need to pay for things and the distribution of wealth. It's important to have those conversations and think about that in the lives of people who are entering the labor market. I'll get off my soapbox now.
I think we may be good.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. This was amazing. And thank you all for coming. Thanks for staying. Thanks for OTI and for Alex for holding down the fort here. And hopefully see folks around other Open Data Week events. And stay tuned for Sion's book.
And the work of my colleagues here as well.
Yeah. And Ezra, I'm definitely going to check out, well, if a 22nd, maybe not, but I'll try to make it.
Yeah,
That mouse working workshop will be awesome.
No pressure.
Bye, all. Thank you.
Night.
Thank you for such a great talk. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
All right. Thank you, everyone.